Hi, my name is Crystals, and I am a trauma dissociative identity response is how I describe how my system is set up. And I'm going to be presenting on, it's called From Ashes We Rise. But before we get started, I just want to give an image description. I'm female-bodied, kind of brownish hair, blue eyes, and a gray shirt with a purplish undershirt. And I got some flowers behind me. Some of them I picked from the garden, and some of them I got from the food pantry. Some of them also have a little bee, a little toy, interesting looking bee in it. And that just kind of reminds me that I'm not alone. I have a group of friends that I like to call my bees. And so that just gives me a little bit of encouragement while I'm giving this presentation, knowing that you all are out there, even though I can't see you, although I'm probably chatting with you right now in the future, because I'm speaking from the past. I guess that's a little confusing. Anyway, I also have a box of Kleenex. I always like to have a box of Kleenex in my background just to remind people that whatever emotions come up, that's all welcome. And I'm going to be flipping between screens from what I can see, but have the view so you guys can see me. So I don't know if that might change the light a little bit, but I'm really glad to be here. And this is my second year presenting, and I'm a little nervous. It's just a lot to, I care about all of you and am excited for what is happening right now. So a little bit about my presentation itself. I use pronouns she or they. My personal pronouns, I alternate between I and we, depending on how we're talking or who we're talking to. Let's see. One of the things about the presentation is there are a couple trigger warnings, potential trigger warnings, that this is going to be a history of peer support, psychotherapy, and trauma treatment. So especially those last two can kind of bring stuff up for people, access and treatment that is helpful. A lot of people have had various responses and difficulties and successes with those. So that might bring up some feelings or reminders of things that were hard. Also, I might allude to, but won't go into, trauma symptoms, child abuse, misdiagnosis, eugenics, and forced hospitalization. And so if any of that stuff is too much, or it might be even a lot, just me listing them all out can kind of feel like a lot, I think. So just really take care of yourself wherever you're at. If you need to leave at any time, I won't take it personally. And I'm just glad you're here. So this is my description is this is a journey through history. How I came up with this presentation was I was writing a newsletter for work and ended up just doing a timeline of peer support and psychotherapy throughout the ages. And so this presentation is called From Ashes We Rise. And I like to think of the phoenix and how the phoenix rose out of the ashes, and that so I'll alternate from things that are ashes, which are things that are hard and things that probably shouldn't have happened, and then the ways that people with lived experience, people with complex trauma and dissociation and multiplicity have risen out of that and despite of that. And this isn't to say that if you haven't overcome whatever you're going through, that there's anything wrong with where you're at, because the struggle is really real. and wherever you're at in your progress, just being here at this conference is a big deal. And just acknowledging that multiplicity exists, that plurality exists, that's a big deal, and that makes a difference in the world. And so the first thing is that throughout history, society has discredited, ignored, and shunned trauma survivors. Yet the tenacity of the human spirit and the power of love continues to shine through. We who have been traumatized and oppressed continue to lead the way in building support for other trauma survivors, and throughout time, even though we are reduced to ashes, sometimes over and over again, we just keep getting knocked back down, and that's what you'll see through this presentation, but we still keep rising. And the other day, I've started meeting with my therapist outside, and we got to this yard, we're meeting in this yard, and there's all this concrete, and in between the spaces in the concrete, there's these little teeny tiny blades of grass. And I just think about like that they just want to grow and live. And even though there's concrete that was put over them, they're still finding that place. And sometimes we just find little tiny bits of ways to get through things that are really hard, where it seems like there is no way to get through it. So there's a lot of misunderstanding around trauma and around how to treat trauma. This is going to focus more on traumagenic, dissociative identity disorder, and complex PTSD. There are differences, but this kind of covers both of them. And I'll go into some advocacy stuff around multiplicity in general, but just so you know that that's kind of the focus. So with the last 3 years, when there is a lot of shutdowns and a lot of people getting sick and a lot of mandates, and like that has really put the whole world in a state of this kind of ongoing trauma on a large society level that I haven't experienced in my lifetime in the same way, because of where I live. So a lot of people who haven't had mental health issues or haven't recognized them are now starting to recognize them in a way that they didn't before. And so this has brought a lot of new awareness for the need for mental health care, but it's also really maxed out the system in a lot of ways. So it's become very, very difficult to get services, and even to get the types of services and the needs that you have. Like some people feel the need to meet in person, and other people need to be in distance. And teletherapy and being able to connect online has really opened up a lot of access for a lot of people, but also some people can't do online, and some people don't have that kind of access. And so it's just a really difficult situation. But the good thing is that there's more awareness, I think, around the need for support and the need for connection. So there's one of the problems is that there is people are treated differently based on the origin of their trauma. So if there's a trauma that happened outside of the family or even outside of the country, like in a war, that's treated profoundly different than a trauma that happened with somebody that you're supposed to have a connection with. And that difference in treatment happens in services. Like I can't get a service dog, or haven't been able to get a trained service dog because I'm not a veteran. And if I were a veteran, I might be able to get services because that trauma and that situation is recognized as something that we want to help and support. And so if I'm walking with my service dog, if I say it's a psychiatric service dog, people assume that I've been to war, when I have been to war, but not in the way that they were thinking of. Like the war I went to is much different. And then even courts will have different ways of treating people and different ways that things get prosecuted. And then understanding and compassion, like So that's all really hard. So let me just talk a little bit about complex post-traumatic stress, also known as CPTSD. And that is the result of repeated ongoing trauma, often beginning in early childhood and often including neglect or abuse from a caregiver. And the effects of that are more encompassing and greater than just post-traumatic stress. So over the decades, there's been a lot more progress towards recognizing and helping people with complex PTSD. Even though it's slow and many people continue to be misunderstood, and a single incident trauma is generally needs to be dealt with a little bit differently than somebody who has been through a lot or a variety of different experiences that caused harm that they're recovering from. So some people can be over medicated or misdiagnosed or hospitalized several times over the course of many years before somebody asks about the trauma or recognizes the extent or the impact. And this can also sometimes lead to different ways that people aren't treated in a way that is best for them. So it's thought to be unique to veterans of war. It's not recognized in minority or marginalized population, and there needs to be more awareness around it. A lot of times it can be misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed as depression, which could be complex grief, like that's not always taken into account. Depression can also look like tonic immobility, where your body is shutting down as a response to help you get through a hard situation. ADD, attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactive disorder, what do you call it? Hypervigilance can look like that. So if you're always needing to be extra aware of your surroundings to keep yourself safe. Bipolar or borderline are some of the other ones where it's not always, although borderline I think is has PTSD within, or has trauma within the diagnostic criteria. I'm not remembering, I'd have to look. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about dissociative identity disorder, which I like to call and see as a response, because it is a response to trauma. And I'm not talking about all forms of multiplicity. I'm talking about this one specific thing and how it is often understood. I don't know the ins and outs of how it works for everybody's system, or even how it works for my system. So I just kind of keep an open mind about how it all goes together. So my thinking for this, what I'm talking about right now, is that young children can develop multiple identities in order to survive severe and repeated trauma. This gives them the ability to participate in their life and have an internal support system. So I think for our system, this was really true, because we were very isolated as a kid. And even though I don't really remember this and I wasn't aware of my multiplicity, I have a felt sense that there was an internal world, an internal community that got me through stuff and helped me survive things that I would have never been able to survive. And so I'm really grateful to everybody in my system and my collective for doing that, and for just that we don't have to be alone. So while this is helpful, it becomes a disorder when people experience amnesia, which is part of the disorder, this thing, distress, internal conflict in the ways that the trauma affects functioning. So the disorder is not multiplicity. Multiplicity is the solution. Yeah. So dissociative identity disorder, which I like to call a response, continues to be disbelieved and downplayed. The National Institute of Mental Health And Kaiser until maybe 2020, 2019, didn't even have an entry for DID. So I was diagnosed by a psychiatrist at Kaiser. I go to look up my diagnosis. It basically says there's no information. That has been updated. The information is not accurate. The first thing they say is this is extremely rare, which we all know, most of us know that it's not extremely rare. It's not rare at all. A lot of therapist finders don't include dissociative disorders, which makes it difficult to kind of screen. There might be some other reasons for that. Therapists are taught that it's rare and a controversial diagnosis. There's misrepresentation in the media, and professionals continue to disbelieve its existence. For most people, it takes 10 years of being in the mental health system. So we're not just talking about like being out in your regular life, but actually being in the mental health system, mostly in therapy, but could be other ways before diagnosis. It took me 10 years at least of being in therapy before anybody recognized the multiplicity. And it wasn't until it was recognized that I really started to make progress and even be able to talk in therapy. So some common misdiagnoses is that a lot of people aren't diagnosed because they're seen as quote unquote high functioning. And so this can happen when it's really adaptive to have the most together person go to appointments and be out in the world. And that can look like high functioning. It can be misdiagnosed. That happened to me a lot, actually, or to us a lot. It can be misdiagnosed as bipolar, schizophrenia. Somebody can have a lot of diagnoses or diagnosed with borderline or attention deficit disorder. There are not enough supporters for this. Therapy is one of the big problems. Therapy is no longer required in the state of California. I don't know about other states or other countries in the world. I just read somewhere that some other countries might have a better requirements for making sure that like supporters and people who are becoming therapists actually know what it's like to be on the other side of the chair. So in 2020, I think for marriage and family therapists, they stopped requiring therapy. There's been a real push towards manualized short-term therapy. And not everybody's able to hear about trauma. A lot of people think they can and think they can handle it, but a lot of people really can't handle hearing those stories. And we really need somebody who can listen to all of what we bring to them. And most therapists don't take insurance, or they have full caseloads. So Susan P. Spannett, who works with a lot of complex, intense abuse cases, not cases, people. Don't want to call people cases, says it requires years of practice, study, and supervision to become really adept at treating trauma. Yet we see generalist therapists with minimal to no trauma training. So a lot of times people are like, yeah, I know how to treat everything, but they actually don't have any training at all. So I say to hold on, the hope can be hold on, pain ends. That there is progress. We are seeing a lot of progress. And although it's slow, that over time things are changing and improving. And so I hope to kind of show some of that the history of the peer movement and psychotherapy, we can see that. As we look to the past, we can see that there is indeed hope for the future. So we're going to go all the way back to 1970s. In the 1970s was when the first feminist organizations were formed. And that was peer support, and they advocated for societal changes. And so that was what I call the We Rise. And so also in 18, 1896, Jean Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet and Sigmund Freud all individually discovered that the root of hysteria was childhood trauma. So for about a decade, and it's interesting because they were all over the world. So for about a decade, therapy focused on empathic listening and attunement. But, and here's the ashes, Freud changed his theory to avoid ostracism within the profession. Like he had people like that were being accused or made known that they were that they had caused harm, and so Freud changed his view and came up with his theory. And we've all heard of Freud, but most of us, I hadn't really heard about Charcot and Janet, and so they weren't really like put up there the way Freud was. So in 1914, soldiers started coming back from World War I, and they noticed that they were responding similarly to women who had been labeled as hysterical. And that's when the term shell shock was introduced. But then in 1907, let me see, so that was 1914. In 1907 through 1963, so same time period, right? 7 years after that, was eugenics, which was sterilization, which is making it so people can't have kids. 64,000 people with mental health issues were forcibly sterilized to keep them from passing faulty genes onto their children. So people were labeled quote unquote insane. They could be locked up for years in institution and were experimented upon and tortured. It was really, really horrible, horrible stuff happened during that time. And out of that, also in 1917, so that's 3 years after they started looking at shell shock, the diagnosis was removed from the literature, and it wasn't looked at as much in the same way. So 1949, this is the We Rise part. The National Mental Health Association declared May is Mental Health Month. So a lot of people know about May is Mental Health Month and celebrate it every year, but not a lot of people know that the specific reason for May is Mental Health Month was to raise awareness of trauma and the impact it can have on physical, mental, and emotional well-being of children, families, and communities. So there really needs to get back to the emphasis, which is on trauma and how that impacts things and impacts mental health. In the 1970s, the psychiatric survivor movement started. The veterans started to bring awareness to trauma. The patients' rights advocates started, the women's movement started, and PTSD was added to the DSM. So veterans started supporting each other. They say if you made it out, like reach back and lift other people back up, there became more awareness of PTSD. A lot of people, I think, are more comfortable seeing it with a veteran who went to war from an enemy outside of one's country. And also, I want to say that this is a bit of a perspective coming from the United States. And I realize that other places in the world may have different views and different experiences based on your history. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from at, because that's where I'm located and that's what my lived experience or history is. So then we also had the women's movement, but some of these things translated globally, like they weren't just in one place. So the psychiatric survivor movement, people would march in the streets. It was people were really advocating to have their voices heard and to have fair treatment. And during that time was kind of where the term consumer came, which I really personally hate the term consumer, because it just reminds me of commerce and buying and selling and marketing and all of that. But what they're really trying to get at was that if you are a consumer and you go to the store and you're buying bread, you have a choice of what kind of bread you buy. And in a lot of situations. You can choose what store you go to in a lot of situations, not all situations. If you're starving and only have a couple of dollars, you might not have very many choices. But the idea being that consumers have choices, and the consumers are the ones that are paying the bills. So even if somebody else is funding it, you are still the one who gets to make the decisions about your care. That does not belong to the doctor, does not belong to the therapist. That belongs to you to make the choices of whether or not something's working for you. So Jay Mahler, I met Jay Mahler. He helped start the consumer movement, was what he called it. He was one of the sweetest guys ever. He was really a great guy. He started the Pool of Consumer Champions, which was located in Oakland, California, and really did a lot of advocacy to getting our voices heard in various situations, in government situations. And he said, this is the last civil rights movement. People are still oppressed. I feel emotion coming up saying this, and he also cried. He was a very sensitive guy. So I'm trying to just, maybe I'm feeling that coming from him, just how strongly he felt about people are still oppressed more than any group in society. He worked, so that's something that he said, because that's what he was seeing in his experience. So he worked so that people who needed mental health support were treated with dignity and had basic human rights, and for services to be provided by people with lived experience who have great empathy because of what they've been through. So he really, really valued the lived experience. After 10 years of mistreatment and abuses in the mental health system, Jay Mahler became a leader in the psychiatric survivor movement. If I had more time, I would go more into the story of how he even landed in a psychiatric hospital, which is quite the story. So in the 1980s, there was rising. The PTSD was added to the DSM. Therapists supported survivors who had been hurt by caregivers, and there was advanced studies of trauma and dissociation. A lot of what is known, in a lot of ways, we're still stuck there. The progress that was made during that time just kind of all came to a halt in the 90s. So for about 10 years, there was a lot of progress. Then in the 90s, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation came to be, and there was also a rise of manualized therapy, which a lot of people are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, which was started by Aaron Beck, who was also part of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. He was one of the founders. So there just came a push from insight-oriented therapy, relational therapy, to this manualized kind of treatment, change your thoughts, change your behaviors. Let's focus on symptoms. Let's focus on changing that, rather than focusing on some of the other ways that therapy were done, more psychoanalytical or psychodynamic. Therapists started getting sued. Evidence, I just already said this, but evidence-based therapy replaced relationally focused therapy. So rather than focus on the relationship between the person receiving therapy and the therapist, it became focused on outcomes and goals, and how do we make symptoms go away, instead of what are the symptoms trying to tell us about what needs support. And there became much more evidence-based research, which sounds good, but the evidence for that can be based on who's supplying the evidence. Statistics can be changed and read and created in different ways. Insurance requirements became a big thing, trying to get funding. So in the 2000s, in 2013, we're rising again here. 2013, there was a trauma section added to the DSM. In 2019, the False Memory Foundation dissolved. Also in 2019, complex PTSD was added to the ICD. I forget what that stands for, but that's the International Code of Disorders, maybe. Somebody could put it in the chat if they know better than I do. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of what it stands for, but it's the diagnostic tool that is used internationally. And in 2021, in California, state of California, the mental health parity was expanded to include PTSD. Before it just included, I'm probably going to miss one, but like schizophrenia, depression, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorders, probably some other, maybe eating disorders, some other disorders. But so it got expanded to include PTSD. So some things, okay, is when you are wherever you're at, whether you are, I don't know, whether you're working in an employed job or you're working full-time on your healing, just that we all make a difference and we all are changing things. Even just being at the conference here is changing things and it's making a difference. That when you bring healing and support and connection and speaking the truth of your experience, that makes a profound difference in the world that you will never know. And if you're focusing on recovery from trauma or healing trauma, one of the things is to go slow to go fast. That a lot of times when we try to push things, especially with complex dissociation and trauma and lots of people in our system, that can just really backfire and shut things down and make it harder and make it so that the people inside of us don't feel safe. Like I might feel okay going in and talking about my trauma, but if other people in my system aren't on board with that, then they're probably going to maybe take some of my memory away, or they might shut me down so I can't talk at all. And so I'm learning just to really like listen to them, and they may communicate in ways of like, I just might get kind of anxious, or I just might lose my thoughts. Like that might be them just saying, hey, this is too much. We need to slow down here. So you don't just get over trauma. Healing from these wounds can be a lifelong journey, which for me, when I heard that, it just kind of helped me relax into it a little bit. Like nothing is wrong with me. What's wrong with me is what was done to me. And my progress is exactly how it is. However, recovery as defined as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential, can definitely be possible. So starting to live a more full life, or just, and I think it's also what you define and what you want for yourself. It may feel like you aren't making progress, and the pain may seem like it will never end, but you are changing and growing. And like I've already said a couple times, like just being here shows that you're committed to learning and to healing. And also, I really believe that we heal together, and sometimes we can feel really disconnected and really alone in the world, and that we're not alone. Like remembering that we're not alone, and also that we're the experts. We're the ones that know what we need and what's best for us. Survivors have taken it upon themselves to educate their community and the people around them, and even the whole world, through conferences like this one. More and more people with lived experience, people with multiplicity, people with dissociative identity response are starting podcasts and YouTube videos and Facebook groups, and are finding ways to support each other. or finding ways to say, hey, this is what happened. This is my experience. This is valid. Some have gone into research to dispel some of the myths. Others have become therapists, doctors, and professors. There's actually really a lot of therapists out there with lived experience of a multiplicity. And they're starting to speak out more. People are starting to get braver and when one person does it, then that can empower somebody else to do it. But this isn't to put pressure on you, because there can be risks with that. And so really looking and about what's right for you, what's right for your system as a whole, and working together around that. Peer supporters are starting to be more recognized for their unique ability to support and connect with people with mental health challenges. Peer supporters can provide hope and empathy because they are intimately familiar with the pain and the struggle. And there's also getting to be more and more resources that are created by people with multiplicity and with complex PTSD, that we're not just the ones that are just like here so broken that we can't do anything, but we're actually making huge changes in the world. In 1971, the Alternatives Conference, and this was in the United States, connecting, organizing, and activating was kind of their mantra, with the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery. Their mission was to include as many diverse perspectives as possible on mental health recovery. So this conference was kind of like, we don't just need the medical model, we need alternatives. And that's what that was about. In 1987, the Hearing Voices Network came up, which challenged negative stereotypes, stigma, and discrimination, was to raise awareness of the diversity of voices, visions, and similar experiences, create spaces to talk freely about voice hearing, visions, and similar sensory experiences, raise awareness of a range of different ways to manage distressing, confusing, or difficult voices. I think some of this is written a little bit more. I'm not going to go into that actually, but it's also to encourage a more positive response to voice hearing and related experiences in healthcare settings. So where voice hearing doesn't have to be this like stigmatized, horrible thing, but like that it actually can be really beautiful and supportive and empowering. In 2007, the Pull of Consumer Champions, started by Jay Mahler, which is what I mentioned before, which is now called Peers Organizing Community Change. And they took a mantra that I think originally came from the autistic community. I'm not exactly sure where this originally came from, but the mantra being nothing about us without us, people in recovery leading the way. And their mission is to improve the quality of life. And it's in Alameda County, that's the county I'm in, for Alameda County residents who have mental health issues, and to provide the consumer perspective in transforming Alameda County mental health services with a recovery vision that is consumer-driven, culturally competent, and holistic in its services and support. We provide a strong consumer voice in the mental health system and in the community. And I think that if you start wherever you're at, you start locally, that makes change. In 2008, An Infinite Mind started, which was a conference that was their mission was to educate and advocate for people with trauma-based dissociation with a primary focus on dissociative identity disorder. The Healing Together conference is for survivors with dissociation and DID, their loved ones, and mental health professionals to come together in learning and growing each year. They say the brain is merely an organ, but the mind is infinite. And they have a bit of a bee theme. That's kind of where I get my bee theme from. But I also really like that they're about kind of bridging communities, the mental health community and the people with lived experience. So 2012, this is a CAMPRO. This is in California, which is California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organization. So this was about peers, another group kind of stepping up and paving the way, organizing and coming together to make a difference. In 2015, the System Speak podcast and their community not their community, but the podcast started, where they really talked a lot about their experience having dissociative identity disorder, and interviewed a lot of clinicians and people with lived experience. In 2019, we had our first Plural Pride, and the Plural Positivity World Conference provides a venue for peer self-help and sharing information between plurals of various types to share our best and show knowledge and materials with each other. And I just want to highlight a couple things that that I didn't realize. Since 2020, which was when the Plural Association became a nonprofit, according to this, they've had 7 public live event conferences, 839 event scholarships, 100 private community scholarships, 100 weekly community group text chats, 25 monthly private community meetups, 100 educational videos, 90 public conference videos, that is amazing, 80 educational articles, 100,000 community interactions, more than that, educated over 225,000 people, organized events for thousands of plurals. And this is the 5th year that they're having this conference. They've had over 50 systems participate in speaking at the various conference. And last year, there were about 25 sessions in English, and also in French, and more than 500 systems attended the conference last year. Their YouTube channel has 90 sessions with, so they are really doing a lot, and we're all here, part of it. So they are a by plurals, for plurals nonprofit. The mission is to empower plurals, where plurals is defined as everyone who self-identifies as being or having more than one individual within a single body, by developing and using their capacities to actively shape their own lives and that of the plural community in the society of which they are part in economic, social, and political terms. So they're unique in that they're not just about a traumagenic system or dissociation, but they encompass all forms of plurality. So at this part, I think it's helpful to think about, like, what helps you? What helps you find your way through? Is it music? Is it going outside? Is it playing video games? Is it doing a puzzle or coloring or listening to audiobooks or reading? Like, we have those things, and not just you, but like what helps your system members and other people in your headmates or your collective, whatever terminology you use. How can you work together to find something that's supportive? And also that we all make a difference. Every single one of you makes a difference when we tell our stories, when we help each other, and when we live our truth, that we're all bringing change, and that even when we're reduced to ashes, that we will rise again, and there is hope, and there is struggle, and the struggle is real. And so just be gentle to yourself. Pay attention to what you're needing, what the other people in your headspace are needing. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you so much for coming to this presentation. And I hope you got something out of it. And thank you for being here, and just have a good rest of your day.